Well, let's continue in Luke 22, starting in verse 39. Now, remember, last lesson we concluded with Jesus saying we have to have a sword, and they've got two, because of Isaiah 53. I hope you read it. It's nice and short. It's all about the Messiah, and it's worth taking time to read. But it says the Messiah would be considered a rebel. Depends on which translation you read. In verse 39, we read this. Jesus left to go to the Mount of Olives. He did this often. His disciples went with him. When he arrived at the mount, he told his disciples to pray that they would not give in to temptation. Then he walked about a stone's throw away from them. There he knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, please take this cup of suffering from me. But Father, what I want is not important. What you want is all that is important." Then an angel came from heaven to strengthen Jesus. He prayed even more passionately until his sweat was dripping to the ground like blood pouring down. What an intense prayer that must have been. Can you imagine? No, you can't. Can't even imagine praying that hard. And then Jesus was strengthened by an angel, and then he prayed even more intensely, and that's when his sweat was pouring like blood. Okay, I want to go back. Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. He did this often. Do you think he did it every time he went to Jerusalem, or was it just during the last week of his life? I bet he went to Mount of Olives to pray every time he was in Jerusalem. It just, from the descriptions we have from some of the historical records, it was a beautiful garden. Olive trees and flowers. Well, more olive trees, but okay. When he got to the mount, he told his disciples pray they would not give in to temptation. Then he walked a stone's throw away from them. My right arm doesn't work very good. I can't throw a stone more than 6 feet. When I was younger, I could throw it 100 feet, maybe 2. How about a Major League Baseball player? Or David Slingshot, I don't know, set a stone's throw. How far? You know, different people have different arm strength. I know, goofy, but that's the way I think. How far away did he go? And he knelt down and said, "Father, if you're willing, please take this cup from me, but what I want isn't important. It's all about what you want." Oh, dear God, help us to pray just like that. God, I know what I want. I know what I think I need. But Father, that doesn't matter. It's what you want for my life. It's what you want me to do. It's what you want me to have. Father, please help me accept that. Not what I want. Not what I think I need. Oh, Lord. Can you pray that prayer with me? And just don't overlook that the angel came to give Jesus strength. In my experience, we don't hear enough about that. Usually it's casually mentioned. When I was growing up, early in my Christian walk, I didn't pay attention when I was a teenager. My parents' church. I knew some of it, but the angel came, and then he prayed so hard his sweat was like blood. Now, can you think of any other time an angel came to earth to strengthen somebody? Yeah, I could think of one. But I went and looked. In the NIV Bible, there are 290 occurrences of the word angel. I looked at every single one of them. We find angels helping people, but strengthening somebody that specific, saying the angel strengthened him, one other time. Can you think of it? One other time. It's not found in the book of Luke. It's not found in the book of John. It's not found in the Old Testament, the book of Acts, or any of the epistles of Revelation. It's found in Matthew and Mark. Matthew chapter 4 and Mark chapter 1. We often call it either the 40 days or the temptation of Jesus. When Jesus went out in the wilderness after he was baptized, for 40 days he fasted and prayed. And then angels, plural, came to strengthen him. Now, I want to go back to this thing about the sweat and the blood. Some preachers make a big deal about, Luke's gospel is the only one that talks about this. And some preachers make a big deal about the sweat-blood concept. They attempt to give medical explanations, usually citing something called hematohydrosis. Yeah. Hematohydrosis. Hematohydrosis. That's actually a Greek word containing the roots of blood and water. I'll leave it to you to research the whole medical concept. It's actually a possibility. However, I'm going to stick to a very more literal approach and say his sweat was actually dripping like blood pouring down, because that's what the Greek says. Have you ever seen a really serious injury where blood is just pouring out? If you have ever done extreme physical activity on a very hot day, you know your sweat does not pour, it drips. This is intense beyond anything I've experienced, and I have done extreme physical activity on a hot day to the point of exhaustion. On the farm, we called that the hay season. I would be out on the hay rack in the sun, lifting those bales off the baler. We didn't have the modern conveyances. I was sweating, and my sweat was dripping all over. It didn't pour off me. I've had more than one injury that led me to bleed profusely. And I can tell you there's a big difference between profuse sweat and bleeding. Blood just pours out. You can decide for yourself. Is it hematohydrosis? Or is it sweat so intense that it's pouring like blood? Well, what we know is Jesus' prayer was intense. All right, verses 45 and 46 says, when Jesus was done praying, he went back to his disciples. He found them sleeping. Exhausted because of their grief, he asked them, why are you sleeping? Wake up and pray so you will not yield to temptation. Oh, we like to condemn the disciples. Couldn't even stay awake while Jesus was praying. Well, first off, I get the feeling Jesus prayed a lot. He was probably very good at it, and the disciples probably weren't as good at praying. They were human. Well, Jesus was human too, but he had motivation. Oh, man. Strength of willpower. Well, Luke says his disciples were exhausted because of their grief. Do you understand why they were exhausted? This is another time where context is often skipped And this phrase is overlooked. But remember that they had just shared the Passover meal, the Lord's Supper. And during the meal, Jesus says one of them is going to betray him. Thinking about that, can you imagine how emotional that had been? Going even further, can you imagine how Jesus felt after such intense prayer, and then he finds his disciples sleeping? Well, I know how I would have felt. How about you? But this is a Son of God, no doubt. He felt compassion. But they were sleeping because they were exhausted from the grief. The grief wore them out. Just thinking about one of them is going to betray him. I can't even deal with this. Have a little compassion. I bet Jesus did. And now we come to the arrest. The exciting part of this week. Makes for a good movie. They've done a lot of them. And this account can also be found in Matthew 26, 47 to 56, Mark 14, 43 to 52, and John 18, 1 through 14. I didn't have those memorized. I had to look. So, first, I've got some questions. How did they know Jesus would be on the Mount of Olives? Because that's where it's going to be. Many preachers say Judas told them, and that's probably true. However, Luke 21:37, last week, or the week before, I think, told us that at least during his visit to Jerusalem, Jesus went to the Mount of Olives every morning or every evening. That's where he prayed, evidently leaving the crowds behind. I think that's Luke 22:37, not 21. But evidently he left the crowds behind when he went there to pray. You know, most people get tired in the evening, especially us old folks. And Jesus went there in the evening to pray. There are probably many people who knew where he went each evening. But we just see that, you know, they're on the Mount of Olives, Jesus praying, disciples falling asleep, and then we come to Luke 22:47 to 48. Just as Jesus said this to his sleeping disciples, just as Jesus said this, a crowd arrived with Judas Iscariot leading them. He walked up to Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked him, Judas, are you going to betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Wow. Did Judas expect that? I don't think so. But he had to follow through because that was a sign. In many cultures, a kiss is a greeting. Now, typically, it might just be a kiss on the cheek, or as you've probably seen in movies in real life, in some cultures, they kiss on both cheeks. There's nothing unusual about a disciple giving a kiss to his teacher. Jesus wasn't the only one with disciples. That was very common in the Greek culture and many other, especially in the Middle East. But that very act of the kiss signifies respect and more. Does that mean Jesus saw through the kiss? Does that mean Judas forgot what a kiss means? And Jesus just reminded him? We don't know. But remember back to verses 36 to 38 in this chapter. Jesus said his disciples should sell their coat, buy a sword if they didn't have one. They said they had 2 swords, and Jesus said that was enough because Scripture said he was with the rebels, Isaiah 53. Next, we see a sword come into action, 49 to 50. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they asked Jesus if they should fight with their swords. Did you know that? I don't hear that very often. The crowd is arrived. Judas is betraying Jesus. When Jesus' followers saw what was going to happen, they asked Jesus if they should fight with their swords. That's verse 49. Verse 50, one of them even cut the right ear off the servant of the high priest. Interestingly, only John's gospel tells us which follower cut off the ear of the high priest servant. John 18:10 says it was Peter. We all probably knew that. Of course it was Peter. Well, who else would you expect? Peter, keep your size 15 sandal out of your mouth sometime. He said he would die for Jesus. He's ready. In verse 51, Jesus said, "Stop. Don't fight." Then he touched the servant's ear and it was healed. My Messiah. Peace. Compassion. Verse 52 and 53, Jesus spoke to the chief priests, the captains of the temple guard, the elders, all of whom had come for him. Am I leading a rebellion? Is that why you've come with swords and clubs in order to arrest me? I've been with you in the temple courts every day and you didn't arrest me. But this is the way you do things, waiting until it is dark. When it's dark, that means Jesus left the crowds behind. So the only crowd there was the one they brought. Overwhelming odds, I'm sure. But evidently Jesus healing the high priest's servant's ear didn't affect anything. I mean, no doubt the anti-Jesus crowd knew he performed miracles all the time. How can you not see him as the Son of God with all the miracles? Sometimes you have to see before you can believe. And some people have their minds closed and they can't believe anything. All they know is what they're told. Better have the right teachers, I tell you what. Verse 54, I'm just going real slow. They seized Jesus and led him to the high priest's house. Peter followed behind the mob. Some have said they were wrong for leading Jesus to the high priest's house. That's crazy. Where would he be taken if not to the high priest? I mean, Rome ruled Jerusalem, but Rome did not care about some Jewish traveling teacher. That's all they saw Jesus as. And just because the Jewish religious authorities did not like him, the Romans didn't care. We'll see that. However, the Jews probably had no police-type force of their own except the temple guards, religious authority and subject to the high priest. So they took Jesus to the high priest. And of course, many condemned Peter for his denial in a few verses. However, Luke says Peter followed behind the mob. Matthew 26:58 says the same thing. Many have asked, was Peter the only one of Jesus' faithful that followed the mob? No. John 18:15-16 tells us this. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard, but Peter had to wait outside. until the other disciple came back and spoke to a servant girl and brought Peter into the courtyard. Now, throughout John's gospel, John never says John. He never says me. And another disciple following Jesus, that's John's way of saying it was me. It was a common practice of authors for several thousand years before Christ and up until, I don't know, not too long before America came around. You wouldn't name yourself. In Mark's gospel, I don't remember the exact verse, it's Mark 14 something. After the arrest of Jesus, it says one young man ran from the mob. His cloak was torn off him and he ran naked. And everyone says that was probably Mark. It was his way of saying I was there. Insignificant detail. Inserted just to say I was there. It was a common practice. So anyway, Peter and John followed. That doesn't mean Luke's account is wrong, or Matthew's, or Mark's. As I often teach, the Gospels are not historical records. They were written to teach, and one Gospel desired to have both Peter and John listed, while John's presence was not significant in Luke's account, or Matthew or Mark's. John's Gospel is the only one that says John was there. All right, let's move on. The high priest's house. Actually, his courtyard, but whatever. That's part of the house in those days. The courtyard actually was considered part of the house. You typically had a wall around your house, and the courtyard would be in front of the entrance. That was the most common way. So let's read verses 55 to 56. Some people had started a fire in the middle of the courtyard outside the house, and they sat down there. Peter sat with them. A servant girl saw Peter sitting in the light of the fire. She stared at him for a while and then announced, "This man was with Jesus." Okay, how would a servant girl know Peter was with Jesus? Some have said it was because of his accent. This was in Judea, and he was from Galilee. And that's very possible because in Luke's account, the third accuser says Peter is a Galilean. Almost verse 56 of this chapter. Almost certainly based on an accent. Now, Luke tells us three different people accused Peter of Peter being with Jesus. And as many have pointed out, Jesus was very famous, and no doubt his chosen 12 would have also become well known. It seems likely that these accusers had seen Peter with Jesus. Verses 57 to 62, Peter denied it, saying she didn't know what she was talking about, that he didn't even know Jesus. A little bit later, someone else saw Peter and said, "You are one of Jesus' followers." Peter said, "No way, I am not one of his followers." About an hour later, another person insisted Peter was with Jesus because he was a Galilean. Peter denied the accusation, saying, "Man, I have no idea what you are saying." As Peter said that, the rooster crowed. Jesus turned his head and looked Peter in the eyes. That was when Peter remembered what Jesus had said. "Before the rooster crows in the morning, you will deny that you know me 3 times. Peter left the courtyard and began weeping. I often ask you to imagine you are one of the people in a scene with the hope that you will better understand the emotions of what is happening in the passage. Here you don't have a choice. I want you to imagine you are Peter. Peter or Jesus, but Peter. Imagining we're Jesus is a very hard thing to do. Imagine you are Peter. You have just denied Jesus a 3rd time. The rooster crows, and Jesus turns and looks at you. Close your eyes and imagine you just denied him for the third time. The rooster crows and Jesus turns and looks at you. Ah, my heart would be breaking. I'd almost feel like I had to double over in pain like a stomach punch. You think that's how Peter felt? Oh, it must have been something. And cutting to the end of this, way out of this story, Peter became the number one most on fire, just like he'd been through many of the Jesus travels. All right, verse 63 to 65. That was when the men who were guarding Jesus began to mock him and beat him. They blindfolded him and told him to tell them who hit him. And they said many insulting things to him. Don't just read over that passage. Read it and think about your Savior being treated this way. Luke 22, 63 to 65. He'd never done anything wrong to anybody ever. Not to anyone. He'd never done anything wrong without people there. He'd never done anything wrong. Hebrews says, I didn't look it up. I forget. But Hebrews says he was without sin. I think it's chapter 6, but don't quote me on that one. I want to read the Message Bible in Luke 22, 63 to 65. Think about this. Close your eyes as I read this. The men in charge of Jesus began poking fun at him, slapping him around. They put a blindfold on him and taunted, "Who hit you that time?" They were having a grand time with him. Wow. Can you imagine your Savior being treated like that? How do you feel about what Jesus endured? Oh, just a few more thoughts in this chapter. We're about to see Luke say there were two high priests, and many will ask something like, I thought there was only one high priest in the Jewish religion. I clipped some notes out of my study in the Gospel of Mark, and here's where the answer comes. According to traditions established by Moses, the Jews would always have a high priest, but just one high priest. So why were there two during Jesus' arrest and trial? The office of high priest was passed on by very strict laws based on the descendants of Aaron, the brother of Moses. However, when the Romans conquered Judah, they appointed the high priest they wanted to deal with. In other words, it became a political office. Annas was made the high priest in 6 AD. Caiaphas was made the high priest in 18 AD. Annas had been the high priest, which meant, in the opinion of the Jews, he would serve until he died. However, the Romans appointed Caiaphas as a high priest. Caiaphas was the son-in-law of Annas. It's interesting that when Jesus was arrested, he was taken to Annas, who still held considerable power in Judah, even though the Romans saw Caiaphas as a high priest. Annas then sent Jesus to Caiaphas. We're told that in John 18. What appears to have happened next is recorded in Matthew 26. We're told Jesus was questioned by the Sanhedrin, which was probably up to Annas or Caiaphas to call, or one of them. And then we go back to John 18. We're told that Caiaphas sent Jesus to Pilate. Well, Pilate's the Roman governor. Caiaphas is the Roman appointed high priest. Luke 23 tells us that Pilate, we're going to get there soon. Pilate sent Jesus to Herod, who returned him to Pilate. John 18:19 18 and 19, tell us that Pilate condemned Jesus to death by crucifixion. You got all that straight? Two high priests. It was confusing to the Jews too. They thought Annas was the high priest. The Romans dealt with Caiaphas. The Jews dealt with Annas. Annas and Caiaphas had to work together somehow. Father-in-law and son-in-law. Blasted in-laws. 66 to 69. At dawn, the elders, including both chief priests and the teachers of the law, all gathered together. They had Jesus brought in front of them and demanded, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." Jesus answered them, "If I tell you the truth, you won't believe me. If I asked you a question, you wouldn't answer me. But from now on, the Son of Man will take his place at the right hand of God Almighty." Well, Jesus was certainly not meek when facing the collective Jewish religious leaders. He doesn't just refuse to answer them, but he challenges them by saying they wouldn't believe anything he said, and they would not answer him if he asked them a question. Then he made a statement, basically saying he would soon be at the right hand of God. I guess maybe he hinted at saying he was the Messiah, which is what they said. Tell us if you are the Messiah. I mean, and that seems to be how the Jewish rulers interpreted what he said, because then they all asked. That's what verse 70 says, just coming up next. But can you imagine all of them at once? They all asked in verse 70. They all asked, "Are you the Son of God?" Jesus replied, "That's what you say." Then they said to each other, "What more do we need? His own words are enough." They seemed to have trouble understanding what Jesus said. But it really didn't matter to them. They'd already made up their minds he was guilty, and they had already condemned him to death. Corrupt judgment. One of the worst cases of corrupt judgment ever. Do you remember what comes next in Luke 23? Yeah, I'll tell you later. Read it for yourself. I love you. Bye now.